Daf Yomi Tractate, Bava Batra, page 36b. Top of the page with the words of Filu Yom Echad Nami. Even if he plowed, okay, so we're in the middle of a question from the previous Amud. The Gemara asks, how can you understand their opinions this way? If so, according to Rabbi Akiva, why specifically require a full month? Now we're on 36b. Even if he plowed the land for 1 day in the first and third years respectively, it should be sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. Rather, everyone agrees that plowing is not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. And here, the difference between their opinions is whether, in order to establish the presumption of ownership, one needs to possess the land long enough to grow major produce, which requires 3 months to grow, or only minor produce, which requires 1 month. The sages taught in a Braita, plowing is not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. Plowing is not sufficient to establish presumption of ownership. Near Eino Chazaka. And there are those who say this is sufficient to establish presumption of ownership. Whose opinion is it that the Braita refers to? There are those who say, Rav Chizda said, it is the opinion of Rabbi Acha, as is taught in a Braita, if the processor plowed the field for a year and sowed it for 2 years, or if he plowed it for 2 years and sowed it for a year, it is not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. Rabbi Acha says this is sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership, which indicates that he holds that plowing establishes the presumption of ownership. Near plowing. Rav Ashi said, I asked all of the great men of the generation about this, and they said to me, with regard to plowing, this is sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. Near Hareza Chazaka. Near. Rabbi Near. Rav Bivai said to Rav Nachman, what is the reason of the one who says that plowing is sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership? Rav Nachman answered, a person is not apt to have his land plowed by someone else and remain silent. Rav Bivi asked, and what is the reason of the one who says that plowing is not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership? Rav Nachman answered, the owner says to himself, let each and every clump of earth enter the plow. That is to say, the owner is amenable to having someone else plow the land for him, and then he will sow and harvest. One waters, one sows, but God gives the increase. The residents of Pum Nahara sent a question to Rav Nachman bar Rav Chizda. Our teacher instructs us, is plowing sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership, or is it not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership? Rav Nachman bar Rav Chizda said to them, Rabbi Acha and all of the great men of the generation say, with regard to plowing, this is sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, is it a novelty to enumerate great men who maintain an opinion without taking into account that of others? But what of Rav and Shmuel in Babylonia, and Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva in Eretz Yisrael, who say plowing is not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. I mean, they're great men also, so. Anyway, the Gemara presents the sources for ascribing to these sages the opinion that plowing does not establish the presumption of ownership. The basis for ascribing it to Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva is the Mishnah, as the Gemara explained above. What is the basis for ascribing this opinion to Rav? As Rabbi Yehuda says, that Rav says that this ruling, that either a month or 3 months is sufficient to use for the first and third years, is the statement of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. But the rabbis, whose opinion is accepted, say with regard to a field, its presumption of ownership is established by 3 years from day to day. The phrase from day to day, miyom liyom, from day to day, serves to exclude what? Does it not serve to exclude plowing, which does not establish the presumption of ownership? What is the basis for ascribing this opinion to Shmuel? As Rabbi Yehuda says, that Shmuel says, this ruling, that either a month or 3 months is sufficient use for the first and third years, the statement of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. But the rabbis, whose opinion is accepted, say he does not establish the presumption of ownership until he harvests 3 date crops, or harvests 3 grape crops, or harvests 3 olive crops. This indicates that Shmuel holds that plowing does not establish the presumption of ownership. What is the difference between the opinions of Rav and Shmuel? Abaye said the difference between their opinions is whether 3 harvests of a young date tree, which produces a crop 3 times in 1 year, establishes the presumption of ownership. The Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Yishmael said, in what case is this statement that 18 months are required to establish the presumption of ownership of a non-irrigated field said? With regard to a white field, in other words, a grain field, but with regard to an orchard, harvesting 3 different crops suffices. Abaye said, from the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, we infer the proper understanding of a detail of the opinion of the rabbis who disagree with him and hold that 3 years of harvesting 1 crop is required to establish the presumption of ownership, even with regard to an orchard. If one had 30 trees of one type in a field, and they were planted with a density of 10 trees per each area required for sowing 1 se'ah of seed, and one consumed the produce of 10 trees in this first year, and of another 10 trees in this second year, and of another 10 trees in this third year, this is sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership.